Hey everyone, so in the last video we talked about the role that genes play in behavior, and jumping off of that or building off of that, we're going to continue talking about genetics and behavior by talking today about genetic similarities and behavior and the study of twins and the study of those who have been adopted to see the role of genetics in behavior. So this first video is a fun video, so to speak. I want you guys to watch this in the PowerPoint version of this video. But this is the story of two twins, or two sets of twins, who married each other, right? So you have two sets of identical twins who are married to another set of identical twins. And these two sets of twins who are married even live together. They plan to have children at the same time. And so it's an interesting little fun case study in looking at the similarities in terms of behavior and the identity of twins throughout their lifetime. All right, so getting into the crux of our content here, genetic similarity, also known as relatedness, is important to researchers, especially in times where we haven't been able to truly study on a molecular level genetics and how they influence behavior. Researchers study genetic similarity to understand the importance of genes to behavior. And the greater the genetic similarity, if there are similarities in behavior, the more then that correlates to genetics being the cause of that influence. However, scientists can only observe the physical expression of a trait. They can't necessarily look at the gene that controls that trait or the genotype. And so it restricts what can be studied to only those observable behaviors. There may be a lot more going on under the surface, and that's why another reason why correlation studies, which a lot of these are, you're correlating or comparing behaviors and seeing when they change or what changes them instead of a true causal relationship. That's really why there's a lot of limitations to those as well. Because we're making educated guesses, but we're still making guesses at the end of the day. In terms of families, these become a very good unit to study genetic similarity because they are more closely related to DNA. You pass on your DNA between the mother and the father to the children. And so you won't learn much through correlating traits, though, in the typical family as an estimate of heritability. For instance, as we talked about last time, expressed behaviors cannot necessarily be determined to be genetic. Everyone in the family could have the same gene, but it only expresses itself in a couple members of the family. And then what is considered a dominant trait in even both parents is not necessarily even apparent in a child. And so these things can be so sort of up in the air in terms of whether they become expressed or not. And the environment, as we talked about last time, has such an effect on whether these genes get expressed that there are some limitations to only studying family units. And like I talked about a few slides ago, really when we take into account correlation studies, we must tolerate some level of uncertainty. And this is most especially true with correlation studies. So twin and adoption studies, as we'll talk about today, use correlation statistics to analyze data, but they do not shed light on particular genes and behavior. And while they show a relationship between two or more things, they never show causation. They never show what causes one thing to happen. And so We need to look at how the data is gathered. We need to look at how it is analyzed. And that tells us a lot more about the reliability, the validity of that particular study, and whether we should take what they are saying with lots of grain of salt or a grain of salt. In terms of expression, this is a principle we've talked about a few times, but not all genes an individual possesses are expressed at all times. And they can be switched on and off, so to speak. This is called gene regulation. And so even in twins, as we'll see today, this can cause a differential gene expression. And so having a gene for a particular behavior does not necessarily mean that an individual will exhibit that particular behavior. So in terms of studying twin and adoption studies, the goal obviously is to estimate the importance of genes to behavior. And when looking at genetic similarity, using twins who have identical or similar genetic makeup would bring us closer to possibly studying that relationship. And adoption studies enable individuals to study how twins raised in different environments are affected behaviorally. So we can see how environment sort of changed the course of behavior for that particular person. There are comparisons between monozygotic or one-cell twins, that's where they developed from one cell, or duozygotic, duo meaning two cells, which are, fraternal twins, are very useful to scientists. Monozygotic twins have more similarity than duozygotic twins because they are an identical genetic code to their twin because they developed from the same cell. All right, so again, in terms of monozygotic twins versus duozygotic twins, monozygotic twins again came from one fertilized egg, start with the same genes. Some of the cells ended up separating and developed differently as the original cell divides many times. And really any trait difference between monozygotic twins are environmental because of that identical genetic code. Duozygotic twins, they come from different eggs that are separately fertilized. They share about 50% of their genes, which makes them about the same as any other brother and sister pairing, even if you're not a twin. And then the differences of traits are both genes and environment. So in terms of twin studies, though, they make a very important assumption. And this is something that we need to take into account as we are looking at research on twin studies. And this is the equal environments assumption. So as it says there, environments are not supposed to make either duozygotic or monozygotic twins more similar. And it is a main assumption of twin research. We are assuming that they are having equal environments within these twin studies. With adoption studies, we can't quite make that claim. And so it sort of controls for environmental influences. It allows scientists to estimate the influence of genes. And the amount of variability in the experience and the behaviors of each twin of traits must be left then for environmental factors. However, there's a few criticisms building off of twin studies. So for one, there are very small samples. There's obviously less twins than there are of single tins or kids that were born alone. And then the second thing is that monozygotic twins usually have a more similar environment than duozygotic twins. And so you have to sort of control for those two things. Monozygotic twins tend to look more similar, and it causes their parents to tend to dress monozygotic twins alike, like we see in the picture on the left. And what could happen is that this greater shared environment could skew the results. On the right, we have another pair of twins. However, as you can see there, they look very, very different. One is taller, one has lighter hair, and this may be the reason for why their parents dress them differently. And so we see here a difference even in research in terms of the comparisons of genetics, of behavior, of environment. All of these things are less likely to be similar for duozygotic twins than monozygotic twins. All right, before we get into the studies, we're going to talk quickly about adoption studies. And adoption studies assume that if parents adopt a child who is not genetically related to them, then any similarity in traits must be related to environmental factors. And so if they take on the behaviors of their adopted parents instead of their biological parents, then there must be a great similarity in terms of the environment that they are in. And similarities between the adopted child and the biological parents must be genetic. And it may be easier to sort of separate the effects of genes and environment in adoption studies than twin studies because of these reasons. They're actually in different environments. And so the similarities and differences that occur between biological parents, adopted child, all of these things could be very different. However, there's a few criticisms of this. The first is in selective placement. Adoption research assumes that there's no selective placement for the child. For those of you who know anything about adoption is very, very costly. And they also try to pick parents who would be suitable and raise children in a suitable environment. And so this means that the adopted parents might be in a much better social and economic position than the biological parents were. Also, screening. This builds off of the selective placement part. Adopted parents are often screened to make sure that they are not impoverished, they do not have mental illness, addiction, criminal records. And so what this causes is a skew again towards more stable environments for the child to be in, and that could really cause a skew in terms of the behavioral patterns between the biological parents and the adopted child. And so why is this an ethical concern? Well, researchers must understand that the trait is likely not there with the adopted parents then at the end of the day. All right, so our first study is a twin study, and this was to study an anti-bullying program in the UK. It is a correlation study. And the aims were twofold. So the first one, how are chronically bullied children different from non-bullied children at age 12, both in mental health and academic success? And then also they wanted to study what were some of the genetic and environmental influences in children who are chronic victims of bullies. So what they did was that they interviewed by asking mothers about twin children's bullying experience in primary and secondary school. If the children were bullied, according to the mother and children were asked to explain the bullying situation. They then did what is called coding, and that's a tool used in qualitative research where they separate out answers into different categories to sort of, compile data and to look at these different categories. So they were coded into either repeated harmful acts, so acts committed on them that were repeatedly harmful, like getting beaten up or something like that, and whether there was a difference in the power between children. And so whether bigger kids were picking on them, picking on smaller kids, or whether it was some other factor that was at the root of this bullying. Children with bullying in both primary and secondary schools were considered chronic victims of bullying as well. And so what they found was that there were stronger correlations between monozygotic twins who dressed alike, more likely, had similar identities, had similar personalities, had a stronger genetic correlation than duozygotic twins. And so this suggested that genetics made a contributions to being chronically bullied. The chronically bullied children had higher rates of mental health problems and lower academic performance because of that. And what were the causes of bullying taking place? Well, what they found was that early adjustment problems like getting used to social life, fitting in, that sort of stuff, and then also lower intelligence. If you're reading when you're in first, second, third grade and you're struggling unfairly, kids may pick on you. And so I'm definitely not saying that's right. I'm just explaining what they found in terms of the reasons for this bullying. Family environmental factors like abuse and neglect, lower socioeconomic class, lack of support for the mothers were also factors that contributed to chronic bullying for the twins. Being made fun of because you are poorer than other kids, or because your behaviors don't quite match up with everyone due to trauma faced at home. All of these things were also factors contributing to this chronic bullying. And so the conclusion was bullying programs need to not only consider environmental factors or who's being bullied, but also genetic and family influences to be most effective. And so focusing on children likely to be victims and aiming them to be more resilient to both genetic and family contributions may help in reducing bullying in the first place. The second study we're going to look at today is called CADORET et al. This is from 1995. And this is an adoption study, and the aim was to see if children adopted away from biological parents with alcohol or antisocial problems would have higher rates of alcoholism than the general public. So trying to compare them to their biological parents. So what they did was that they took 95 males who were adopted at birth, so they never lived with their biological parents, and they were studied until adulthood. For those guessing at home what type of study this is called a longitudinal study, and it's also a correlation study because they're not actually experimenting on these individuals. And so the two hypotheses that were made, males adopted away from biological parents with alcohol problems would have higher rates of alcoholism than the general public. And then males adopted away from biological parents with antisocial behavior would also have higher rates of alcoholism than the general public. Because antisocial behavior has been shown to lead to higher risk of alcoholism. Maybe you turn to alcohol earlier as a way of coping with the daily stresses of life instead of reaching out to social connections and other people. And the data included interviews with adoptive parents, psychiatric testing of adoptive parents, and testing the adopted children for alcohol problems into adulthood. So the results were that they showed correlations that supported both hypotheses. Biological parents with alcohol problems and or antisocial behavior all correlated to adopted children's risk as adults. And so what we can conclude from this is that there are two genetic pathways that contributed to alcoholism in adopted males, antisocial behavior and alcoholism of the biological parents, and also looking at the genetic risks for alcoholism on the whole. So in terms of evaluating this study, there are strengths of adoption studies. They control for environmental factors, and they provide a starting point for explaining genetic risks for alcoholism. But they also have some limitations. There's in all adoption studies, there's a difficulty of getting samples for ethical reasons. There are privacy laws for biological parents in the US. Maybe you can't find them. Maybe they don't want to be found. Oftentimes, those who choose to give their children up for adoption are in lower classes where they were unable to provide for the child. Maybe they were younger parents, teenage parents, where they may have other families now where they don't necessarily, they feel like they've moved on for this time in their life. And so perhaps they don't want to be gotten in touch with. And so it hurts the number of people they could possibly contact for this study. There were design problems of early pioneering studies that never interviewed the adoptive parents. Maybe the adoptive parents, for as much as they try to control for addiction problems, maybe one of the adoptive parents were either antisocial or had alcoholism in their lines or genetic lines. And then adoption studies also tell us nothing about how genes interact with the environment. Perhaps stress was an issue for the adopted children in addition to the biological parents as well. And then the last point we can make here, and I'm sorry for the pause there, is in considering whether samples of those with European ancestry necessarily generalize to people of all sociocultural backgrounds. Would this study be the same for other races, other ethnicities, in terms of looking at these particular genetic correlations? And that's a question that we need to do more research on. All right, with that being said, that sort of ends our two lessons on the role of genetics and behavior. We're going to continue talking about biological level of analysis next time by talking about pheromones and then hormones and then evolutionary psychology. So really looking at the role that genetics has played through the generations in terms of how we've developed as human beings. All right, have a great day, and as always, if you have any questions, please come find me.